She was a young woman overcoming obstacles.
She had these cognitive challenges that created some difficulties.
But she graduated from high school.
She's just a woman who was looking for love.
And she'd finally found it.
He is giving her some sincere attention.
She's found someone that accepts her.
Somebody who really sees her.
But her happiness would be short-lived.
Hey, ambulance.
She had been beaten up.
How many people jumped on her?
I can't remember.
Was it simply because she was different?
She had developmental delays.
She didn't speak up for herself.
She was bullied throughout her lifetime.
Or had her desire for love lured her into a trap?
Someone took total control of their life.
And she wasn't the only victim.
That's what I feel like. Torture.
Her situation was similar.
Not only is he a serial abuser, he is a chronic liar.
There are monsters out there in the world.
September 7th, 2014. It's a quiet Sunday evening in Lumberton, North Carolina, a town of only 20,000, 2.5 hours southeast of Charlotte.
Lumberton is very rural. It's in the southeastern part of North Carolina. There's a lot of good in Lumberton.
Everybody knows each other. And when things go down, news travels.
And the 911 call that comes in at around 5 o'clock is sure to get everyone talking.
Robertson County 911. Do you need ambulance or the law?
Hey, ambulance.
The caller is 29-year-old Christopher Lennon.
My girl is not waking up.
He says he's found his girlfriend, Princess Powell, unresponsive in their living room.
You say she's not waking up?
No.
He doesn't have a working cell phone, so he went next door to use the phone to make the 911 call.
Okay. Okay, stay on the line.
After dispatching first responders to Chris and Princess's address, the operator tries to get some preliminary information.
Do you know if she's breathing?
I don't know.
Christopher was hysterical.
And based on what he tells the dispatcher, it's easy to see why.
She's breathing about 2 months.
Princess Powell was a lovable soul who had faced unique challenges in her young life.
She did have special needs, which set her apart a little bit.
Her level of thinking was probably about 5 or 6 years behind of what her actual age is. Talking about baby dolls or just talking about things that you expect a typical 9 or 10-year-old to discuss and not a 16 or 17-year-old.
Which sometimes caused problems for the teenager.
As far as princes and all kids that's in that bracket, the biggest challenge for them is peer pressure.
She was one of the people that was bullied throughout her lifetime.
And then when you fall within that spectrum, then you only want acceptance. So I think Prince's biggest challenge is I just want to be treated like an individual. I want to fit in.
Princess did finish high school, but soon faced a new challenge.
She became pregnant.
She might not understand the future ramifications of that, but in the right now, I can see her smiling and just, everybody she ran across, she probably was rubbing her belly and saying, I'm pregnant.
But reality soon intervened.
After she gave birth to her oldest child, she gave her parents custody.
With her challenges, she wouldn't have been able to do everything as a mother. So like in the middle of the night when a child wake up, she may need to warm a bottle or diaper change. She would have needed that assistance or someone to help her to be able to understand that. This is a real live baby. It's not a baby doll.
Although her parents had legal custody and responsibility of her son, Princess remained in his life.
She still lived with her parents.
She was able to spend time with her son.
Her mom and stepdad make sure the child is well cared for.
But the experience left Princess wanting more from life.
She's just a woman who was looking for love.
Sometimes we need to be reminded that just because someone has special needs, that doesn't mean that they can't have secure attachments.
And in 2011, at 18 years old, she finally found it when she met Christopher Lennon.
He was 8 years older than her.
To an 18-year-old that might have been impressionable and looking for love, not even considering having special needs, I could see where Princess might have thought he might have been her saving grace, very knowledgeable and more established. That would have been very appealing.
That's especially true considering the bullying she experienced as a teen.
Here, Christopher comes along and is not one of those bullies. And he is giving her sincere attention. For someone like Princess with those cognitive struggles, that will make her feel like, whoa, I have found my soulmate. Finally, I found somebody who really sees me.
You're so beautiful.
She feels a sense of belonging, a sense of security.
She seemed genuinely happy with him.
The relationship moved quickly.
When people have young love, they go full speed ahead.
Before anybody realized anything, she was packing everything up and moving in with him.
And the following year, she had even more exciting news.
I'm pregnant.
Really?
Yeah.
What better thing to be able to conceive a child with the love of your life, to be able to start fresh.
This was an opportunity to get it right. Another shot at giving birth to a child that she and her partner would love on and raise right there in their home.
And then, less than a year after Princess gave birth to their little boy, the couple was expecting again.
Even if there are some challenges as being a mother, it appears that she is functioning, she's moving on her journey.
But now, Princess's journey appears to be in jeopardy.
Chris called 911 and says he's found Princess unresponsive on their couch.
Do you know if she passed out or what happened?
No.
Then, too distraught to talk, he hands the phone back to his neighbor.
There was no cell phone, no landline in the home. So he went to a neighbor and borrowed their phone.
He said he woke up. She was lying about it. Okay. Tell him he needs to calm down.
This was very scary for him.
With first responders on the way, the dispatcher sends Christopher and his neighbor over to the couple's trailer to check on Princess.
Okay, listen, is she breathing? Have him see if she's breathing. He can feel her breathe.
The answer appears to be no.
Ask him, does he want to try and do CPR? No, I think it's too late for that. I'm sorry? I think it's too late for all of that.
The neighbor is someone who used to work at a funeral home.
I think she gone.
And when EMTs arrive on the scene a few minutes later, they confirm it.
They declared her dead.
And it didn't appear that she died from natural causes.
They noticed bruising to her face.
It was clear that she had suffered an assault of some kind.
Major Grimes, we'll need you at this location, please.
In the small town of Lumberton, North Carolina, 21-year-old Princess Powell had overcome numerous obstacles to build a happy home with her boyfriend, Christopher Lennon.
She's found someone that accepts her for who she is.
They had a child together and another one on the way.
But now, first responders have declared Princess dead and requested homicide detectives at the scene.
Major Grimes, we're gonna need you at this location.
She had bruising about her face, a lot on her right side and above her eyes.
In addition to the bruising, there was also evidence of blood coming from her nose.
Detectives are also able to determine that Princess has been dead for some time.
She was cold and rigor mortis was setting in.
Looking around the house, the detectives find traces of blood.
You had blood that was in the bathroom of the residence. You had blood that was in the kitchen.
There was blood on the refrigerator door, along the walls, even on the cabinets.
Unsure where and how the attack on Princess occurred, the detectives turn to her boyfriend Chris to see what he can tell them.
Thank you, officer. Thank you. We appreciate it very much. All right, come with us.
On the scene, he was very friendly, very cooperative.
Just have a seat for us, Chris.
What about all the marks on her? Bruises and stuff on her face?
Chris then indicated they had left the night before around midnight, 1 a.m., walking towards the BP near their home.
She like walking all the time, man. We'd be bored at the house.
He and Princess walked down, made a purchase, and then began walking back home. As they got close to the residence, a vehicle pulled up and several females exited. He seen the females walking towards Princess.
Look who we got here!
So he goes and runs for cover.
Let's go, baby, let's go! I mean, what could I do?
And he assumed Princess had been right behind him.
I told her to come on.
Christopher says he hid. And when he heard the car pull away, he'd emerged to find Princess lying on the ground.
He sees that
You okay, baby?
she has been beaten.
I guess she couldn't keep up or something.
You okay?
She says she's okay, and they proceed to go home.
Look, let's get you home. Come on.
Back at the house, Princess cleaned herself up.
Which could explain the spots of blood in the kitchen and bathroom.
She's able to collect herself to the point that he says she's acting normal.
But Christopher says that as the evening went on, he became increasingly concerned about Princess and their unborn child.
At some point, she ends up in the bathroom for an hour.
Hey. Hey.
He thought that it possibly could have been a miscarriage because she was in there for so long.
Princess.
He was able to convince her to allow him into the bathroom, and he helped her off the toilet and back to the living room onto the sofa.
But after he got her settled on the couch, things still didn't seem right.
She started there talking out of her mind.
You want to go to the emergency room?
I think I just need to rest.
Okay.
I told her lay down, maybe she'll feel better.
But in hindsight, that was a mistake.
I woke up this morning and I looked at her like that and I said, oh.
Princess! Princess,
It was possible that her head injury was more serious than she had realized.
I mean, I was just in shock.
Chris is still in such shock that when the detectives turn back to the women that attacked Princess, there's little he can tell them.
He couldn't give us the color or the make of the vehicle.
They couldn't describe any of the women except for that they were black.
It was dark last night, man.
And the person who could help detectives the most is dead.
It's entirely possible that Princess knew her attackers.
Back during her school days, she was bullied.
Is it possible some of her bullies came back?
Or is Chris not being as forthcoming with the detectives as he appears?
He abandoned his pregnant girlfriend while she was being sought.
When police press Chris about his relationship with Princess, he says things are great between them.
He denied that there was any type of problems within the relationship.
There's no arguments, there's no fights, there's no issues whatsoever.
But there was something weighing on them.
He said that a few months earlier, the state had taken custody of their oldest child.
He couldn't really communicate to the police why that happened.
Although he hinted that it could have had something to do with Princess's disability.
They've been coming to the house, well, for our visitations.
They were working very hard at getting their child back.
They were getting through that. And this new baby that was on the way was gonna make things even better.
After finishing up with Christopher at the crime scene, the detectives go to inform Princess's family of the devastating news.
They're distraught that their princess is gone.
And when the detectives relay what Christopher told them, her parents struggle to make sense of it.
They described her as a very mild-mannered, very loving, very easy to get along with person.
However, her parents admitted that Princess could have run into trouble in the past year.
Why do you say that?
Well, we really haven't been in touch with her.
Once she started living with Chris, the family really stopped seeing her, stopped being able to communicate with her.
That raised an immediate red flag for detectives.
Dictating who you can and cannot communicate with, that's one of the primary signs of control and abuse.
Princess Powell's family has just told the detectives investigating her murder that they haven't spoken to their daughter in nearly a year.
Her family says that once she got with Chris, that she no longer communicated with them.
He met her right after she graduated from high school, and that's when he began to put a wedge between her and her family and friends.
But they say the real break came once the couple moved in together.
The family really stopped seeing her, stopped being able to communicate with her.
And she even stopped coming by to see her son.
What happened next was even more surprising.
Their disability checks that was coming to them to help support her older son had been redirected back to her.
Why do you think she'd do that?
It wasn't her. It was Chris.
Having special needs sometimes makes a person susceptible to being easily taken advantage of or being easily manipulated.
She often had problems making decisions on her own, and that enabled Chris to take advantage of the situation.
Once he isolated her from the family, knowing Princess, she would not have gone anywhere without his permission.
Okay, but Princess never told you he was abusing her, right?
We suspected it, yeah.
However, they never were able to confirm because of the lack of contact with her.
But Princess's stepfather says he did see firsthand just how much power Chris had over her.
A month or two ago, I was at the gas station.
And when he saw her, he was shocked to see the condition that she was in.
He notices a black eye on Princess's face.
Princess! He attempted to speak to her, and she just ignored him.
And she walked right by me.
Worried, he'd followed Princess.
He tried to pull her aside in the parking lot and say, hey, you don't have to live like this. Please, come home. We love you. You have options.
But Princess continued to ignore him.
Princess, come on home, baby. We miss you. Princess.
It wasn't long before Chris noticed, of course, and Chris just really went off on her stepfather.
Leave her alone.
He was telling him, I'm tired of seeing you around. You need to stay away.
That was the last time I ever saw her.
You both have our deepest condolences.
Disturbed by what they've learned from the family, the detectives return to the trailer park to talk to Chris and Princess's neighbors.
The neighbors never saw Chris beat Princess, but they did report hearing screams coming from the home where Princess and Christopher were living.
It was a volatile, violent relationship, completely opposite of how Chris described it.
The neighbors also say that Princess was very submissive to Chris.
Several of the neighbors said that anytime you seen them together, he always walked in the front and she walked behind him and would often be seen with her head looking towards the ground. She didn't speak much. If you did try to talk to her, he would take over the conversation.
She was not given permission to speak. She was not encouraged to participate in conversations.
I immediately went to, this was a person who wanted to control her and would not let her be herself.
But it's what their friends and neighbors, Melissa Nichols and Kevin Harris, have to say about the day leading up to the murder that really interests detectives.
Chris had been drinking throughout the day, and they observed Princess walking behind him, and she appeared to be crying at some point.
Now, can you tell us why you think Princess was crying?
He beat the crap out of her, would be my guess.
On several occasions, Chris would tell him about the times that he beat Princess.
Chris was very vocal and very bold about his life with Princess, that he's got a relationship where he's doing what he wants to do.
And what he did most was beat up Princess.
So you saw Chris hit Princess?
But not exactly.
But according to Kevin, it wasn't really a secret either.
He told detectives that a couple months prior, they dropped by the trailer to see Chris and Princess.
We never actually saw her that night.
Chris actually told them, she can't come out right now.
He told them, I beat her bad. She looks like a monster.
Two friends of Chris Lennon and Princess Powell have told detectives investigating Princess's murder that Chris admitted to beating her.
They said that they went to the residence to see them, and Princess never came out the back room.
He said that he beat her so badly, she looked like a monster.
He's taking her ice packs and going back and forth to the room to give her something to deal with the swelling, but the friends never got to see her.
So when they got home, they said they called the police.
Law enforcement would actually go out and do a well-being check on Miss Princess.
Did the cops come out?
Yeah, but they didn't do nothing.
She said she was assaulted by someone else.
When pressed by the neighbors who had made those calls, she would admit that Chris had done these things to her, but never to the police.
Oftentimes, victims will protect their abusers because they love their abusers. And I can imagine that Princess felt like she didn't want the love of her life to go to jail for that.
It's very frustrating as an officer because you want to do what's right. But if the victim is not willing to testify, then you can't bring criminal charges.
And now, her friends fear that reluctance had cost Princess her life.
They discussed noise they heard around 2 or 2:30 a.m. on the morning of the incident.
Tell us about these noises that you heard.
She was screaming.
And that was coming from their trailer?
Yeah.
Think about the timeline. That's way different than what Christopher is describing with this brutal attack by a pack of women.
After talking to the couple's friends, the detectives bring Chris in for a formal statement.
Detectives start by going back over what he told them at the scene.
The location that we took the first statement was in my patrol car.
At the beginning of the interview, he was very calm. But as the interview began to unveil his untruthfulness, his whole demeanor changed, his attitude changed. The only person that told me y'all had this great relationship was you.
Who? Nobody else don't know us.
The detectives counter by describing what neighbors had told them.
There's one thing other everybody always said. You walk first and she walked behind with her head hanging low.
They also talked about how friends and neighbors said he rarely let Princess speak to them.
That's because she can't talk that good.
She can't talk that good?
Nah, she can talk. She talk to me fine, but she'll mess up sometimes and she don't want to be embarrassed around somebody.
And when the detectives ask him about the time he'd beaten Princess so badly he'd locked her away so her friends wouldn't see, he denies it completely.
I don't lock our bedroom doors don't even lock. How could I lock her in the bedroom?
And then you would treat her with cold rags because you beat her. She looked like a monster, according to what you told this person.
What? I told the person what?
That you beat her so bad he can't see because she like a monster.
No, I did not say that.
He claimed that his neighbors fabricated the whole story.
Me and him done got in fights before. And he don't like me.
When the questioning turns to the night of the murder, Chris continues to deflect.
Somebody said that they seen y'all walking from a couple of trailers back over that way last night, and that she was walking behind you crying. That would have been a true statement.
They're asking questions about shrieks and screams coming from the home.
I don't know what you're talking about with that, sir.
So somebody said they heard fighting going on in your house last night. They weren't telling the truth either.
Nope. Nobody want to say that because we don't do stuff like that.
Well, yeah, somebody said that.
Well, if they did, they lied.
Chris is still sticking to his story, in spite of everyone saying the same thing.
He maintained that the death of Princess was a result of her being assaulted as they walked home by several females. You seen the vehicle pull up?
Mm-hmm.
So was it a car or was it a truck?
I say maybe, I can't ever remember, man. So much stuff happened last night, you know.
Chris says all he knows for sure is that he woke up the next morning and Princess was dead.
Princess! I told you what happened, that's what happened.
But as the interview goes on, the detectives have even more reason to suspect that's not the case.
As the truth was being unveiled about him being dishonest in the death of this Princess, he began to get nervous. He would begin to wipe his forehead, state it was hot in the room.
You want me to open that door, bro? Maybe to cool off a little bit?
Yeah, but I'm really ready to go because, like I said, I ain't did nothing. I mean, like I said, I don't know why I woke up to my girl like that. I mean, if I would have did something like that, I would have not even tried to make a commitment or anything with coming down here or nothing like that. I would have been trying to get halfway to Mexico right now.
The detectives don't believe him, but they'll need more evidence to charge him.
They have to let him go.
After securing a search warrant, they head back to the couple's trailer.
We return to the scene of Princess's death.
And this time, they bring luminol.
Luminol is the product that, once it's applied, it can show where those blood spots were that you cleaned up.
And once detectives sprayed it inside the trailer, it revealed the truth about Princess's death.
It all had transpired right there.
Detectives in Lumberton, North Carolina, are all but convinced that Christopher Lennon is responsible for the death of his girlfriend, Princess Powell.
All the signs are there that this guy is abusing his partner.
And when the couple's trailer is sprayed with luminol, the signs say he murdered her too.
It now becomes apparent that a crime did actually take place inside the home.
You had blood that was on the hallways, on walls, and there was a large amount of blood in the kitchen area right by the refrigerator.
There was also evidence that Chris had tried to cover up the crime.
You could actually tell where the mop had actually swirled through the blood where he had cleaned up behind himself.
When the detectives returned to the station to review the results of Princess's autopsy, it confirms that she was beaten to death.
The initial autopsy report revealed that her death was a result of blunt force trauma.
She had multiple broken ribs and a punctured lung.
But it could not tell what the blunt force trauma was caused by.
However, the autopsy does show that her death couldn't have been caused by an attack on the side of the road, as Chris claimed.
Her injuries that she sustained were so bad that there was no way that Princess could have made it home.
So the story that Chris painted for the police initially, where she'd got back to the house, became completely unreasonable and illogical.
We knew that Chris wasn't being truthful.
The autopsy also confirmed that Princess was pregnant.
However, while Chris told detectives she was only 2 months pregnant, the autopsy says otherwise.
She was a lot farther along. The fetus had developed to the point where you could recognize the little fingers and the little toes and the eyes.
With the results of the luminol and the autopsy, the detectives have enough evidence to charge Chris.
He was arrested and immediately taken into custody for the death of Miss Princess and their unborn child.
He's charged with first-degree murder and the felony murder of an unborn child.
But despite the mountain of evidence against him, Chris continues to insist he's innocent.
When Chris was arrested, he doubled down on his story and made no omission of guilt.
News of Chris's arrest comes as the community is still mourning the loss of Princess.
One of the teachers came back the next day and she was like, "You're not gonna believe what happened." And she shared with us the unfortunate circumstances of what happened, and that just broke my heart. I probably cried for about 2 or 3 days.
When you have this type of an incident in a smaller community like Lumberton, it affects the entirety of the community.
However, Princess's death also highlights the lack of support available in a small town like Lumberton.
Being in an underserved community that lacks resources, maybe not a lot of education around domestic violence, it's tough enough for an individual to feel like they need to get out of this situation. And if they don't have the means to do it, then they feel like there's no way out, and so they just stay.
Especially in the case of someone like Princess.
For individuals who are special needs, we need to reassure them that you don't have to follow what anybody says. You have a mind of your own, and you pretty much know what right or wrong is.
It's unfortunate that there were not supports available to her.
Because Princess could never break free on her own.
People would notice these marks on her body and would ask her, "Princess, what are these marks on your arm?" And she would always, "Oh, no, I burned myself cooking." She would always provide cover for Chris.
And as the detectives build their case against him, they discover Princess isn't the first woman Chris has abused.
We started interviewing past girlfriends who was connected to Christopher.
That's how the detectives find a woman named Kelly Howell.
And Kelly Howell is a former girlfriend of Christopher.
She felt compelled to come to talk to the detectives.
She understood all too well exactly the life that Princess lived with Chris.
He's beat, abused every girl that he's been with.
Shortly after Christopher Lennon's arrest for the murder of Princess Powell and her unborn child, a woman named Kelly Howell has come to the station to speak with the detectives working the case.
Kelly Howell is a former girlfriend of Christopher Lennon. How long y'all date?
3 years.
Kelly said that when she heard about Princess's death, she automatically knew in her heart that Chris had caused this young lady's death.
According to Kelly, that's because she knew exactly what Princess had been through.
She stated that Christopher was very, very controlling and that she was unable to maintain jobs because of his control, his anger.
He was very jealous. If I went around anybody that was a guy, whether I knew him or not, I couldn't speak to him.
If she went to a grocery store and they acknowledged her or called her a name such as babe, she would be beat when she got home.
I had black eyes. He hit me all in the face.
She stated that she experienced several physical assaults.
He held me down, and I remember him asking me questions, and he would burn me, light a lighter, and burn me with it. And I still got a scar right there.
She says that Christopher's abuse was so bad that she often feared for her life.
There was times that he would grab me by my throat, and I just wouldn't know if he would let me go in time. But there was plenty of times I thought that I was going to die.
But unlike Princess, she had eventually managed to escape.
Kelly had some freedoms and was able to have some autonomy where Princess did not.
She had the freedom to go to work, to drive.
And one day she left and never looked back.
So he has no contact with you?
No contact.
But when she heard what happened to Princess, Kelly knew she had to come forward.
You know, I swear to God, I heard about this girl being beaten to death, found on a couch in that trailer park. He was the first person to come to my head. He was the first person.
The detective has no doubt that Kelly's instincts are correct.
Her situation was similar to Miss Princess's, but I think he learned from her relationship. Princess could not work. She was not allowed to work. She was not allowed to go anywhere. In his first relationship, she got away. And I think this relationship, he wasn't going to let that happen.
And unfortunately, Princess's disabilities made her easier to control.
He knew what women to target, and he actually built his skills from prior relationships.
But no matter how much he honed his manipulation tactics, there was one thing Christopher couldn't change.
Why don't you listen?
He was very easily angered.
And the detectives believe that's what took over him on the evening of the murder.
Chris had been drinking throughout the day, according to witnesses. And I think something triggered him, that evilness that he possessed. And that is when the assault occurred.
Why you made me chase you, huh? Huh? Where you going, huh?
Stop!
It wouldn't have been unusual for him to beat his partner, to torture this young lady and abuse her. But this time, he went too far, and it cost her life.
However, while the theory explains what happened, it makes securing a murder conviction problematic.
Trying to prove that he intentionally killed Princess was going to be a real challenge.
Was this just another episode of him getting a little heated, abusing her some, but not to the point of death?
As a result, the prosecutors work out a plea deal.
His charges were reduced to second-degree murder.
He's also allowed to enter what's known as an Alford plea.
Which means that he's not admitting that he committed this second-degree murder, but he acknowledges that, yeah, they got enough evidence against me to convict me.
In exchange for his plea, Chris receives a sentence of 31 years in prison.
I'm satisfied because it is 30+ years that a female on this earth will not be assaulted by Christopher Lynn and his evilness.
However, many who knew Princess feel as though it still falls short of justice.
We're talking about an individual and an unborn child. So in actuality, you took the life of two people, not one. Is 30 years enough? I don't think so.
But no matter what they think of the plea deal, everyone agrees that what happened to Princess was an unspeakable tragedy.
What really bothers me about what has happened here is we're supposed to be a small, close-knit community. We say it takes a village. Here's someone over here suffering that really needs our help, and we really let her down.
To take advantage of anyone is bad, but to specifically target people such as Princess is even worse.
There are monsters out there in the world, and it just breaks my heart. The world lost a bubbly, energetic human being.
He took the life of someone who was loved, a person who was fragile and timid, but was loved.
In southern Louisiana, the landscape can make distance feel deceptive. A road disappears behind a line of trees. A ditch runs beside an empty stretch of land. Beyond it are fields, waterways, small communities, in rural places where one parish slowly gives way to another. To someone passing through, these places may appear disconnected. But between 1997 and 2006, somewhere within this landscape, a series of deaths began to accumulate. At first, there was no single case called the Bayou Strangler investigation. There was no obvious list of victims arranged neatly in chronological order. There were individual names, individual files, individual bodies discovered in different places, and in many cases, different law enforcement agencies looking at what appeared to be different crimes. It would take years before investigators began to understand that these deaths might not be separate at all. By the time Ronald Joseph Dominique was arrested on December 1, 2006, the investigation had grown into something far larger than anyone could have seen at the beginning. Dominique would ultimately confess to killing 23 males, ranging in age from 16 to 46. The alleged killings stretched across nearly a decade, from 1997 to 2006. The victims were young men, teenage boys, and older men. They came from different circumstances. Some were living difficult lives. Some struggled with instability. Some had histories involving drugs or previous criminal records. But none of those circumstances changed the essential fact of the case. They were human beings, and one by one, they disappeared from the lives of the people who knew them. Their names would eventually form a list: David Mitchell, Gary Pierre, Larry Ranson, Oliver LeBancs, Joseph Brown, Bruce Williams, Manuel Reed, Angel Mejia, Mitchell Johnson, Michael Vincent, Kenneth Randolph Jr., Anoka Jones, Datrell Woods, Larry Matthews, Michael Barnett, Leon Lirette, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Wayne Smith, Chris DeVille, Nicholas Pellegrin, Christopher Sutterfield. 23 names, 23 alleged murders. But the number itself can obscure what it represents. A number can make a tragedy sound organized, almost clinical. 23 is easy to remember. It fits into a headline. It becomes part of the description attached to a killer. But before the number existed, there were individual people, individual disappearances, individual deaths. And for years, there was no single investigation that could see all of them at once. Ronald Dominique was born in 1964 in Thibodaux, Louisiana. As an adult, he lived primarily around Houma and Bayou Blue, in the network of communities and parishes that make up southern Louisiana. By the time his name became publicly connected to the series of killings, he did not fit the simple image many people expect when they imagine a serial murderer. According to the available description in this case, he appeared relatively quiet and lived a comparatively private life. He had held ordinary jobs. There was nothing in his outward appearance that automatically announced the scale of what investigators would later accuse him of doing. That contrast is often tempting to explain. When a case like this becomes known, people search backward through a suspect's life, looking for a single answer. A childhood event, isolation, sexuality, personal failure, illness. Some hidden psychological key that supposedly unlocks everything that came afterward. But the facts provided in this case do not allow such a conclusion. Those explanations may appear in speculation surrounding the case, but speculation is not evidence. A difficult past does not automatically produce a killer. Social isolation does not explain murder. Personal identity does not explain murder. And no single characteristic can carry the weight of 23 deaths. The facts of this case are disturbing enough without inventing a psychological explanation that cannot be supported. What can be examined is the pattern that investigators eventually uncovered. Dominique's alleged victims were generally males, from teenagers to middle-aged adults. Many were vulnerable in ways that may have made them easier to approach, and in some cases, easier for society to overlook. The available information describes a method of approach based not necessarily on immediate violence, but on persuasion and opportunity. Offers involving money, drugs, sex, or private encounters could bring a victim into Dominique's company. What happened after that was very different. According to the pattern later reconstructed by investigators, the encounters could become coercive. Restraint became part of the circumstances described in the cases. Death often involved strangulation or asphyxiation. And afterward, bodies were left in isolated places, ditches, rural roads, sugarcane areas, fields, and other locations across southern Louisiana where distance and geography could conceal what had happened. The landscape itself became part of the investigation, not because Louisiana created the crimes, but because the geography helped divide them. A body found in one parish belonged to one jurisdiction. Another body discovered elsewhere could enter a different investigative system. The victims did not all disappear from the same street or from the same neighborhood. Their cases were spread across southeastern Louisiana, involving areas connected to parishes including Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, St. Charles, Iberville, and Assumption. When investigators looked at one death in isolation, the similarities were not always immediately visible. One victim might have a history that seemed unrelated to another. One body might be discovered in a ditch, another near a rural road, another in a different parish altogether. Some deaths were clearly suspicious. Others were not initially understood in the same way. The larger pattern existed before investigators could see it. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. A serial killer does not necessarily announce himself through a single dramatic event. Sometimes the pattern emerges slowly, almost reluctantly, from paperwork and comparisons. A detective notices something. A forensic result connects two cases. A witness remembers an encounter. An investigator begins asking whether one death resembles another. The question changes. It is no longer, who killed this person? It becomes, could the same person have killed them both? And once that question is asked, the boundaries of the investigation begin to expand. One of the cases that would later become particularly important involved Manuel Reed, a 21-year-old man whose body was found in the Kenner area in 1999. Reed had been strangled, and there was evidence indicating sexual assault. His case contained details that investigators could compare with other deaths. Amale victime, contact with another man, a private encounter, restraint, strangulation or asphyxiation, an isolated location. None of those details alone identified Ronald Dominique. But patterns are not built from one detail. They emerge when the same kinds of details begin appearing again and again. Even then, certainty remained elusive. After the death of Michael Vincent in January 2000, the known sequence appeared to pause. For investigators, a gap like that creates its own uncertainty. Had the person responsible stopped? Had the crimes continued without being recognized? Were there other cases that had not yet been connected? The available facts do not provide a definitive answer. Then, in 2002, the sequence resumed with the deaths associated with Kenneth Randolph Jr. and Anoka Jones. In 2003 came Datrell Woods, whose death was connected to asphyxiation but was not initially understood as a clear homicide. That detail would later become important because it revealed one of the central problems in reconstructing a series of crimes. If a death is not initially recognized as murder, it may never enter the same investigative category as other homicides. And if it is outside the category, it can remain outside the pattern. By 2004 and 2005, the sequence appeared to accelerate. Larry Matthews, Michael Barnett, Leon Lirette, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Wayne Smith, Chris DeVille, Nicholas Pellegrin. The intervals between some of the deaths were becoming shorter. In April 2005 alone, August Watkins and Kurt Cunningham were both among the victims associated with Dominique's later confession. Then came Alonzo Hogan in July, Wayne Smith in August, Chris DeVille in September, and Nicholas Pellegrin in November. Somewhere inside those accumulating cases was the shape of a serial investigation. But recognizing the shape of an investigation is not the same as identifying the person responsible. That required evidence. It required comparison. It required investigators to move beyond the boundaries of individual case files. And eventually, it required one name. The case would turn on forensic evidence, including DNA connected to Manuel Reed and evidence involving Oliver Lubanks. It would also involve a man named Ricky Wallace, who survived an encounter with Dominique and later provided information about the way Dominique could approach potential victims. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 would affect the progress of forensic work and evidence processing, adding another complication to an investigation that had already stretched across years and jurisdictions. Then, on December 1st, 2006, Ronald Dominique was arrested. What followed was the moment that transformed the scale of the investigation. Dominique began to speak. According to investigators, he did not simply attach his name to one death. He provided information about victims, locations, methods, and places where bodies had been abandoned. Some of the details corresponded with information already contained in investigative files, including details that had not been broadly released to the public. Eventually, Dominique confessed to 23 killings. But even that confession did not mean the legal story was simple. 23 confessed killings did not become 23 separate convictions. In 2008, Dominique entered a plea agreement involving 8 counts of first-degree murder. He received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. That distinction matters. In true crime, numbers can become blurred through repetition. A killer confesses to 23 murders, and the phrase is repeated until it sounds identical to being convicted 23 times. But they are not the same thing. The investigative record and the legal record are related, yet distinct. Dominique was connected by his confession and the investigation to 23 deaths, while his convictions resulted from 8 first-degree murder charges resolved through a plea agreement. The difference is not a technicality. It is part of the truth of the case. And truth matters because the people at the center of this story cannot speak for themselves. Their stories have to be told with the distinction between fact and assumption intact. We do not know everything about what happened during every encounter. We do not know whether every unanswered question will ever have an answer. We cannot prove, based only on the available information, whether there were victims beyond the 23 Dominique confessed to killing. We cannot look into his mind and state with certainty why he stopped during some periods or why the pattern appeared to resume. Dominique offered his own explanation, claiming that fear of returning to prison played a role and that he killed to eliminate potential witnesses after sexual assaults. But even a confession must be examined carefully. A person can admit to an act while still attempting to shape the explanation of that act. A confession can reveal the truth about what happened without making every justification offered by the confessor true. So this story begins not with an answer, but with a problem that took nearly 10 years to understand. A landscape of separate communities, different police jurisdictions, isolated roads and fields, men and boys who did not all live the same lives but shared a terrible connection that would only become clear later. And somewhere among those cases was a man who, for years, was able to remain unidentified. When the investigation finally reached Ronald Dominique, the discovery did not simply close one murder case. It forced investigators to look backward through almost a decade of deaths and ask how many times. The same pattern had appeared before anyone could see the whole picture. The answer, according to Dominique's own confession and the cases linked to him, was 23. But before there was a number, there were names. And before the name Ronald Dominique became attached to the label Bayou Strangler, there were 23 people whose lives had already been reduced to separate files, separate investigations, and separate questions. This is where their story begins, not with the killer, but with the long silence that allowed the pattern to remain hidden. 23 lives. Ronald Joseph Dominique was born in 1964 in Thibodaux, Louisiana, and as an adult, he lived primarily around Houma and Bayou Blue. These communities existed within the wider network of parishes and rural areas of southeastern Louisiana. a region where populated streets could give way to country roads, fields, ditches, waterways, and isolated stretches of land. It was in this environment that a series of deaths would eventually be connected to one man. But before investigators had a name for the pattern, there were only individual victims, individual disappearances, individual families waiting for answers, individual cases that did not necessarily appear connected when viewed separately. Dominique himself did not initially attract attention because he looked like an obvious threat. The information available describes him as relatively quiet and private, someone who had held ordinary jobs and lived a comparatively unremarkable life on the surface. That outward appearance is important, but it should not become an invitation to invent explanations. There are many attempts in true crime discussions to look backward at a murderer and construct a single psychological story from childhood. Sexuality, illness, loneliness, or other personal circumstances. Those theories may appear in reporting about Dominique, but the available facts do not establish that any of those things caused the murders. There is no responsible way to reduce 23 deaths to one supposed psychological explanation. What can be examined more carefully is whom Dominique targeted and how vulnerable circumstances may have affected the visibility of the victims. According to Dominique's confession and the cases associated with him, the victims were 23 males between 16 and 46 years old. Their names, ages, and approximate dates form a chronology that stretches across nearly a decade. David Mitchell was 19 and was killed in July 1997. Gary Pierre was 20 and died in December of that year. Larry Ranson, 38, was killed in July 1998. In October came Oliver Lubanks, 27, and Joseph Brown, only 16. Bruce Williams, 18, followed in November. Then came Manuel Reed, 21, in May 1999, Angel Mejia, 34, in June, Mitchell Johnson, 34, in August, and Michael Vincent, 23, in January 2000. After that, the known sequence contained a significant gap. In October 2002 came Kenneth Randolph Jr., 20, and Anoka Jones, 26. Datrell Woods, 19, was killed in May 2003. The following year brought Larry Matthews, 46, and Michael Barnett, 21, both in October 2004. In 2005, the deaths came with greater frequency. Leon Lirette, 22, in February. August Watkins, 31, and Kurt Cunningham, 23, in April. Alonzo Hogan, 28. In July, Wayne Smith, 17, in August, Chris DeVille, 40, in September, and Nicholas Pellegrin, 21, in November. Christopher Sutterfield, 27, became the final victim in the chronology provided. In October 2006. Looking at that list today, it is difficult not to see a pattern. But investigators did not have the luxury of knowing the ending when these men were alive. They did not know that their cases would eventually be placed side by side. They did not know that a man who appeared quiet and ordinary would eventually confess to 23 murders. Each case had to be approached through the information available at the time. And that is where one of the most troubling aspects of the case begins: vulnerability. Several of the victims were described as living difficult or unstable lives. Some had problems involving drugs or had previous criminal records. Those circumstances do not make someone less deserving of attention. They do not make a disappearance less painful or a death less important. But they can affect how quickly a missing person is reported, how much public attention a case receives, and how investigators initially interpret what happened. A person with an unstable life may disappear without immediately generating the same alarm as someone surrounded by a large, closely connected family or community. That does not mean authorities ignored these victims. It means that the circumstances surrounding a disappearance can make the investigative path more difficult. Dominique's alleged method of approaching men appears to have exploited opportunity. The information provided describes encounters that could begin with offers involving money, drugs, sex, or private meetings. The initial contact did not necessarily look like the beginning of a violent crime. A person could agree to meet another man without realizing the danger that followed. Once the victim was with Dominique, however, the circumstances could become coercive. Restraint was part of the pattern described in the investigation, and many of the deaths involved strangulation or asphyxiation. The bodies were then left in isolated areas, ditches, fields, sugarcane areas, rural roads, and other locations away from ordinary public activity. Geography became an important element of the case. Southeastern Louisiana is not a single compact investigative jurisdiction. The cases were spread across multiple parishes, including Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, St. Charles, Iberville, and Assumption. Each parish had its own investigative responsibilities. A death in one location did not automatically become part of an investigation taking place somewhere else. This fragmentation matters because serial murder is often recognized through comparison. A single case may contain a clue that seems insignificant. A second case may contain a similar clue. A third can make the similarity difficult to dismiss. But that comparison only becomes possible if the cases are brought together. For years, the deaths connected to Dominique did not exist as one unified story. They existed as separate events. One of the most important cases in the eventual reconstruction was that of Manuel Reed. Reed was 21 when he died in 1999. His body was discovered in the Kenner area. The available information states that he had been strangled and that there was evidence of sexual assault. Investigators began to compare Reed's death with other cases. The similarities were not based on one isolated fact. Instead, several elements appeared capable of fitting into the same pattern: a male victim, contact with a man before death, a private encounter, restraint, strangulation or asphyxiation, and disposal in an isolated area. The significance of Reed's case would become even greater later, when DNA evidence connected Dominique to it. But at this stage, the important development was conceptual. Investigators were beginning to ask whether the deaths belonged to the same series. That question would remain difficult because not every case carried the same investigative clarity. Datrell Woods provides an important example. Woods was 19 when he died in 2003, and his body was found in the Bayou Blue area. His death was associated with asphyxiation, but according to the information provided, the case was not initially treated as an obvious homicide. That distinction is crucial. If a death is not recognized as a murder, it may not receive the same investigative treatment as a confirmed homicide. It may not immediately be compared with other murder cases. The pattern can remain invisible even when the underlying facts are already there. The same problem applied to the broader geography. The bodies were not all discovered in one location. They were spread across rural and semi-rural areas of southern Louisiana. The killer did not need to create a single recognizable crime scene. The environment itself provided countless places where a body could be left. But the landscape did more than provide concealment. It also created investigative distance. A detective working one case might not know what another agency had discovered elsewhere. A forensic clue might remain within one file until someone had a reason to compare it with another. And when the victims themselves were socially vulnerable, the disappearances could become even harder to connect. By 2004 and 2005, the number of deaths associated with Dominique began to rise more quickly. Larry Matthews and Michael Barnett were killed in October 2004. Leon Lirette followed in February 2005. Then in April came August Watkins and Kurt Cunningham. Alonzo Hogan died in July. Wayne Smith, only 17, was killed in August. Chris DeVille died in September, and Nicholas Pellegrin in November. The list was no longer a handful of isolated cases separated by long periods of time. It was becoming a series. Yet even then, investigators still needed to determine who could be responsible. There is a tendency, after a serial killer has been identified, to look backward and assume the pattern must have been obvious. It rarely is. The pattern becomes obvious only after the pieces have been assembled. At the time, every piece existed independently. A victim was missing. A body was found. A forensic examination was performed. A report was written. A family waited. Another case emerged somewhere else. The connections were there, but they had not yet been fully understood. That is why the victims should not be remembered merely as a list attached to Dominique's name. David Mitchell was not simply victim number one. Joseph Brown was not merely the 16-year-old. Wayne Smith was not merely another name in a sequence that accelerated in 2005. Each was a person whose life existed before the date recorded beside his name. The information available for this account does not provide enough detail to reconstruct their individual personalities, families, occupations, or private lives, and it would be wrong to invent those details simply to make the story more dramatic. Their dignity does not require fictionalization. What the facts establish is enough. 23 men and boys were identified by investigators as victims associated with Dominique's confession, and each death became part of a much larger investigation. The final name, Christopher Sutterfield, entered the chronology in October 2006. By then, the investigation was approaching its decisive stage. For years, the cases had existed across different places and different files. Now investigators were beginning to move toward a single suspect. DNA evidence would become central. A surviving witness named Ricky Wallace would provide important information about Dominique's approach to potential victims. And on December 1, 2006, Dominique would be arrested. But before that happened, investigators still had to bridge the distance between suspicion and proof. They had to determine whether the man living among these communities was connected not to one death, but to a pattern that had stretched across almost 10 years. The victims had already supplied the first part of the answer. Their names, their deaths, the circumstances surrounding them, and the similarities between their cases formed a trail. The challenge was to follow that trail without losing sight of the people who had left it behind. The most disturbing aspect of the Ronald Dominique case is not that investigators eventually discovered a pattern. It is how long that pattern remained fragmented. By the time the full picture emerged, the deaths stretched across almost a decade and involved men and boys ranging in age from 16 to 46. Yet there was no single crime scene, no single parish, and no single moment that immediately revealed the presence of a serial killer. Instead, there were encounters that appeared ordinary at first, disappearances that could have seemed unrelated, and bodies eventually discovered in places where the landscape of southern Louisiana could conceal them from view. According to Dominique's later confession and the investigative information associated with the cases, his method often began with an invitation rather than an obvious attack. The approach could involve money, drugs, sex, or the promise of a private encounter. This distinction matters because it helps explain how victims could willingly enter a situation without realizing that they were walking into danger. There was no need for Dominique to force every victim into a vehicle or seize them in public. The alleged method relied, at least in part, on creating circumstances in which the victim agreed to accompany him. Once the victim was isolated, however, the encounter could change. The available information describes restraint, coercion, sexual assault in some cases, and deaths involving strangulation or asphyxiation. The bodies were then abandoned in locations that were difficult to monitor: ditches, fields, sugarcane areas, rural roads, and other isolated parts of southern Louisiana. It was a method that exploited both human trust and geography. But the victims were not interchangeable, and the sequence of deaths did not unfold in a perfectly predictable pattern. The first name in the chronology is David Mitchell, 19, who was killed in July 1997. 5 months later, Gary Pierre, 20, became another victim. In July 1998, Larry Ranson, 38, was killed, followed that October by Oliver LeBanks, 27, and Joseph Brown, 16. Bruce Williams, 18, died the following month. At this point, viewed from the future, the series already contained several characteristics that would later become significant. Male victims, varying ages, encounters that could lead to private locations, and deaths associated with strangulation or asphyxiation. But investigators did not yet have the knowledge necessary to see the entire sequence. A serial pattern is not created when investigators discover it. It exists before they recognize it. In May 1999, Manuel Reed, 21, became another victim. Reed's case would later become particularly important because his death contained forensic evidence that could be connected to Dominique. His body was found in the Kenner area, and the available information states that he had been strangled and that there was evidence of sexual assault. There was also relatively little indication of prolonged physical resistance. For investigators, the significance of Reed's death would eventually extend beyond the individual case. It could be compared with other deaths involving male victims, private encounters, restraint, and strangulation or asphyxiation. But at the time, those similarities did not automatically identify a perpetrator. They were clues, not answers. After Reed came Angel Mejia, 34, in June 1999, and Mitchell Johnson, 34, in August. Then came Michael Vincent, 23, in January 2000. The sequence appeared to stop. That gap created uncertainty. If the same person was responsible, had he stopped killing? Had he moved somewhere else? Had he changed his method? Or were there other deaths that had not been recognized as connected? The available information does not provide a definitive answer, and that uncertainty should remain part of the story. What is known is that the chronology resumed in October 2002 with Kenneth Randolph Jr., 20, followed by Anoka Jones, 26. In May 2003, Datrell Woods, 19, was found in the Bayou Blue area. His death was associated with asphyxiation, but the case was not initially treated as an obvious homicide. That detail illustrates one of the fundamental problems in the investigation. If investigators do not initially understand a death as murder, they may have no reason to compare it with other homicide cases. A case can remain isolated not because there are no similarities, but because the similarities have not yet been recognized as significant. By 2004, the sequence continued with Larry Matthews, 46, and Michael Barnett, 21. Then came one of the most active periods in the chronology. Leon Lirette, 22, was killed in February 2005. In April, August Watkins, 31, and Kurt Cunningham, 23, were among the victims. Alonzo Hogan, 28, followed in July. Wayne Smith, 17, died in August. Chris DeVille, 40, died in September. Nicholas Pellegrin, 21, became another victim in November. The concentration of deaths during this period made the pattern increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Yet even a growing pattern still had to be connected to a person. The geography remained an obstacle. The cases involved southeastern Louisiana and multiple parishes, including Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, St. Charles, Iberville, and Assumption. A body discovered in a remote area could be investigated as an individual case. Another death in a different parish might be handled separately. When viewed from the perspective of a single file, the connections were less obvious. When viewed together, they became increasingly disturbing. Dominique's method, as later described by investigators, depended heavily on the vulnerability of the situation rather than immediate public violence. The offers he allegedly made could bring men into private environments. That meant there might be no witnesses to the initial contact and no obvious public confrontation. Once inside an isolated setting, the victim could become completely dependent on the person who had brought him there. The information about Ricky Wallace would later provide investigators with an important glimpse into this process. Wallace had contact with Dominique and was invited to a trailer. The encounter involved proposals related to drugs and sex, followed by a proposal that Wallace be tied. Wallace refused. Most importantly, he survived. That survival gave investigators something the cases involving the dead could not: a first-hand account of how Dominique could approach a potential victim. Wallace's experience would become an important piece of the larger picture because it showed that the alleged method did not begin with a struggle. It could begin with an apparently voluntary meeting and only later move toward restraint and danger. That distinction is important when examining the cases of the men who did not survive. It does not mean that every victim experienced exactly the same sequence, and it does not prove every detail of Dominique's later account. It simply provides a documented example of an encounter that, according to the information provided, could have become dangerous in a similar way. Christopher Sutterfield, 27, became the final victim in the chronology in October 2006. By then, the investigation had reached a point where Dominique's name could no longer remain separate from the deaths. Forensic evidence was becoming central. DNA connected Dominique to Manuel Reed, while hair evidence associated with the Oliver LeBancs case was also reported as consistent with him. These details changed the nature of the investigation. Suspicion could now be tested against physical evidence. The cases were no longer connected only through similarities in victims and circumstances. There were forensic links that investigators could examine. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 had also affected the progress of forensic investigation and evidence processing, adding another complication to an investigation already spread across time and geography. But the evidence continued to move the investigation toward Dominique. On December 1, 2006, he was arrested. The arrest marked the end of one phase of the investigation and the beginning of another. Investigators now had an individual suspect. They had forensic connections. They had information from a surviving witness. And they had nearly a decade of deaths to examine. What they did not yet have was the full story from Dominique himself. That would change during questioning. Dominique began providing information about the victims and the circumstances surrounding their deaths. According to investigators, his statements included details about locations, methods, and places where bodies had been abandoned. Some of the information corresponded with facts already known to investigators, including details that had not been widely released. Eventually, he confessed to 23 killings. But a confession, even one containing accurate information, does not automatically explain everything. Dominique also attempted to frame some of his actions in ways that could reduce his responsibility. He claimed that certain victims had agreed to participate in bondage-related sexual activity and suggested that he sometimes allowed people to leave when they refused. His statements about motive also focused on his fear of returning to prison. He said that after sexual assaults, he killed victims to eliminate witnesses and avoid being sent back to prison. These explanations would become part of the investigative record, but they could not simply be accepted without scrutiny. A confession can contain facts and self-serving interpretations at the same time. The task for investigators was therefore not simply to listen to Dominique. It was to compare what he said against the evidence already collected. That distinction would become essential as investigators worked backward through the years. 23 names had now been connected to one man. But the question remained, how many of those cases could be independently established? And how many would ever result in a courtroom conviction? The answer would come not through another discovery in the Louisiana landscape, but through the legal process that followed. And that process would reveal an important difference between what Dominique confessed to, what investigators believed they could prove, and what the courts ultimately recorded as convictions. The arrest of Ronald Dominique on December 1, 2006, did not happen in isolation. By the time investigators took him into custody, the investigation had already been developing for years, shaped by a collection of deaths that initially appeared to belong to different cases in different jurisdictions. The significance of the arrest was that investigators were finally able to place a name beside a pattern they had been struggling to understand. But getting to that point required more than suspicion. It required connections between victims, forensic evidence, witness information, and Dominique's own statements. The first obstacle was geography. The deaths associated with Dominique were spread across southeastern Louisiana, involving several parishes, including Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, St. Charles, Iberville. An assumption. Each individual death could be examined within its own local context. A body discovered in a ditch or rural area might be investigated by one agency, while another death somewhere else might be handled by another. The circumstances surrounding the victims could also make the cases appear different. Some victims were young, some older. Some had difficult personal circumstances. Some had histories involving drugs or previous criminal records. Not every death was initially understood to be a homicide. That meant the investigative connection could not simply be found by looking for identical crime scenes. Instead, investigators had to compare details that were initially scattered across separate files. One of the recurring elements was the identity of the victims. They were males, many of them relatively young, though the ages ranged from 16 to 46. Another recurring element was the manner in which Dominique was believed to approach them. Rather than necessarily using immediate public violence, he could allegedly offer money, drugs, sex, or a private encounter. The victim might willingly accompany him. Only after the encounter became private could the situation change. Investigators also identified similarities in the use of restraint and in deaths involving strangulation or asphyxiation. Finally, there was the location of the bodies. Ditches, fields, sugarcane areas, rural roads, and isolated places appeared repeatedly in the broader picture. None of these elements alone identified Ronald Dominique, but together they created a pattern that investigators could investigate. Manuel Reed became particularly important in this process. Reed was 21 when he died in May 1999. His body was discovered in the Kenner area, and the available information states that he had been strangled and that there was evidence of sexual assault. His case provided investigators with more than the circumstances of a death. It eventually provided forensic evidence capable of linking a suspect to the crime. DNA recovered in connection with Reed was later compared with a sample from Dominique and produced a match or association connecting Dominique to the case. That development was critical. Until then, investigators could recognize similarities between deaths. But similarity does not establish identity. DNA is different. It creates a physical connection that can be tested against a suspect. The Reed evidence therefore helped move Dominique from the category of a possible person of interest toward a suspect with a direct forensic link to a victim. Another important piece involved Oliver LeBancs. The information provided states that hair evidence associated with the LeBancs case was consistent with Dominique. Again, the importance was not that one piece of evidence magically solved the entire investigation. Rather, multiple independent lines of information were beginning to point in the same direction. A suspected pattern, a possible method, similar victim characteristics, isolated disposal locations, a surviving witness, and forensic evidence associated with individual cases. The investigation was becoming cumulative. One clue strengthened the significance of another. This is often how complex homicide investigations develop. The breakthrough is not necessarily a single dramatic discovery. It can be the gradual accumulation of evidence until the possibility of coincidence becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Yet the investigation was not progressing under ideal conditions. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 affected the region and also affected the progress of forensic work and evidence processing. The storm added another complication to an investigation already dealing with multiple jurisdictions and years-old evidence. The delay mattered because forensic evidence becomes especially valuable in cases where the suspect is not immediately identified. The longer a case remains open, the more important preserved evidence can become. At the same time, investigators had another form of evidence that no laboratory could produce: a survivor. Ricky Wallace had encountered Dominique and lived to describe it. According to the information provided, Dominique invited Wallace to a trailer in circumstances involving drugs and sex. At some point, Dominique proposed tying Wallace. Wallace refused. He left the encounter alive. That simple fact made Wallace an important witness. Most victims in the investigation could no longer explain what had happened to them. Wallace could. His experience gave investigators a way to understand how Dominique might approach a potential victim before violence occurred. It suggested that the encounter could begin without obvious coercion. A person could enter the situation voluntarily, believing that he was agreeing to something very different from what would ultimately happen. Wallace's account therefore helped illuminate the alleged method. It did not prove that every victim had experienced the exact same sequence, but it provided an independent example of the type of encounter described in the broader investigation. It also gave investigators an opportunity to compare a living witness's experience with Dominique's later statements. That distinction would become increasingly important. Once Dominique was arrested, he began talking to investigators. His statements were significant because he provided information about the victims, locations, methods, and places where bodies had been abandoned. Investigators did not have to rely solely on his willingness to confess. They could compare his claims with information already contained in case files. According to the supplied material, some of the details he provided corresponded with facts that had not been publicly released. That gave his statements additional investigative value. If a suspect provides information that investigators already know, the statement can still be meaningful. But when he provides specific information that had not been widely disclosed, investigators have a stronger reason to examine whether he possesses knowledge of the crime that an uninvolved person would not normally have. Dominique eventually confessed to 23 killings. The number was staggering, but the confession also created a new investigative problem. A confession is not the same thing as independent proof. Investigators still had to determine which statements could be supported by evidence and which parts of Dominique's account might reflect his own attempt to explain or minimize his actions. Dominique did not simply describe himself as a predator who had systematically selected victims and killed them. In some of his statements, he claimed that victims had agreed to bondage or sexual activities and suggested that some people who refused could leave. He also gave an explanation for why he killed: fear of returning to prison. According to the supplied information, Dominique had previously been arrested in connection with a 1996 rape, and he said that after sexually assaulting victims, he killed them to eliminate witnesses and avoid imprisonment. This explanation became part of the case, but it should not be mistaken for an established psychological diagnosis or a complete explanation of his behavior. It was Dominique's account of his own motivation. Investigators still had to compare it with the physical evidence and the circumstances of individual cases. That comparison was particularly important because the victims could not testify for themselves. Their evidence existed in forensic reports, case files, witness accounts, and the circumstances in which their bodies were found. The investigation, therefore, became an exercise in reconstruction. Investigators had to move backward through years of deaths and ask the same questions again. Who was the victim? Where was he last seen? What circumstances surrounded the disappearance? Where was the body found? What caused the death? What evidence remained? Was there any connection to Dominique? And could Dominique's statements be independently verified? Christopher Sutterfield, 27, whose death in October 2006 was the final case in the chronology provided, was particularly important because his disappearance occurred close to the period in which Dominique was arrested. But the investigation was never simply about the most recent case. The purpose of Dominique's confession was that it opened a window into years of earlier deaths. It allowed investigators to revisit cases that had once seemed disconnected and examine them through a new framework. The landscape had not changed. The roads, fields, ditches, and rural areas remained where they had always been. What changed was the information investigators possessed. Places that had once seemed unrelated could now be interpreted as pieces of the same investigation. Names that had once belonged to separate files could now appear together. And deaths that had once been investigated individually could now be examined as part of a possible series. This was the turning point, not simply that Ronald Dominique had been identified, but that investigators finally had the opportunity to compare the entire history of the suspected killings against one person. Yet the final measure of that evidence would not come in an interrogation room. It would come in court. There, the difference between suspicion, confession, investigative linkage, and legally proven guilt would become impossible to ignore. Dominique had confessed to 23 murders, but the criminal justice system would ultimately record 8 convictions. Understanding why those numbers are different is essential to understanding what happened next. The arrest of Ronald Dominique on December 1, 2006, marked the moment when years of fragmented investigation finally converged on one person. For nearly a decade, men and boys had died across southern Louisiana, and investigators had struggled to determine whether those deaths were connected. Now they had a suspect whose name was supported by forensic evidence and witness information, and the investigation entered a new phase. The question was no longer simply who might be responsible. It became a much more difficult question: what did Ronald Dominique know, and how much of what he said could be independently verified? Dominique eventually began providing investigators with information about the killings. According to the material available for this case, he confessed to 23 murders. He described victims, locations, methods of approach, and places where bodies had been abandoned. The significance of these statements was not merely the number of deaths he claimed responsibility for. It was the level of detail investigators could compare against information already contained in the case files. Some of the details he provided corresponded with facts that had not been widely released to the public. That distinction mattered. A suspect claiming responsibility for a crime is not automatically telling the truth. People confess falsely. People exaggerate. People minimize. People reshape events to make themselves appear less responsible. In a case as large as this one, investigators had to separate confession from corroboration. Dominique's statements, therefore, became another source of evidence to be tested rather than an unquestionable explanation of everything that had happened. One of the most important elements of the confession involved the way Dominique described approaching potential victims. He indicated that encounters could involve offers of money, drugs, sex, or private meetings. This corresponded in broad terms with the experience of Ricky Wallace, a man who had encountered Dominique and survived. Wallace had been invited to a trailer under circumstances involving drugs and sex. Dominique then proposed tying him. Wallace refused. Unlike the men whose deaths were being investigated, Wallace was able to leave. His account gave investigators an independent example of how an encounter with Dominique could begin, and how quickly the situation could move toward restraint. But Wallace's experience also illustrated why investigators had to be careful. It could not establish that every victim had followed precisely the same sequence. It could show that the general scenario described by Dominique was possible and had occurred at least once. That distinction mattered when investigators evaluated the confession. Dominique also offered his own explanation for why some encounters ended in murder. According to the supplied information, he said he feared returning to prison. He had previously been arrested in connection with a rape in 1996, and he explained that after sexually assaulting victims, he killed them to eliminate witnesses and avoid the possibility of imprisonment. This was his stated explanation for the killings. It is important to distinguish that from an independently established psychological motive. A confession can reveal what a suspect says he was thinking, but it does not necessarily explain every reason behind his behavior. Dominique's account also contained elements that appeared designed to reduce his responsibility. In some statements, he said that victims had agreed to bondage or sexual activities, and that if they refused, he could let them go. This description was consistent in part with Wallace's survival. but it could not automatically be applied to every victim. The men who died could not challenge Dominique's version of events. Their absence made corroboration essential. Investigators therefore returned to the physical evidence. Manuel Reed's case was particularly significant because DNA evidence connected Dominique to Reed. Reed had been 21 when he died in 1999. His body was found in the Kenner area, and the case involved strangulation and evidence of sexual assault. The forensic connection between Reed and Dominique provided something that words alone could not provide: physical evidence placing Dominique in relation to the victim. Hair evidence associated with the Oliver Lubanks case was also reported as consistent with Dominique. These pieces of evidence gave the confession a broader context. The confession was not standing alone. It was being compared against forensic findings and investigative records. That process was especially important because the 23 deaths had occurred over many years. Evidence had been collected at different times, under different circumstances, and in different jurisdictions. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 had also affected the region and complicated the progress of forensic investigation and evidence processing. The investigation therefore had to operate within the limitations imposed by time, geography, and the condition of available evidence. Dominique's confession offered investigators a way to revisit those cases with information that had not previously existed. He could identify locations that investigators might otherwise have considered unrelated. He could describe circumstances surrounding particular victims. He could direct investigators toward places where he claimed bodies had been abandoned. Each statement could then be compared with the existing record. The process was less dramatic than the moment of confession itself, but it was far more important. A confession becomes meaningful in a homicide investigation when investigators can test it. If Dominique's description of a victim matched known facts, that supported the reliability of the statement. If he provided a location consistent with the known disposal site, that provided another point of comparison. If he described information not publicly available, investigators had another reason to believe he possessed genuine knowledge of the crimes. But none of this meant that every element of his account had been independently established. The legal system would eventually draw a much narrower line. Dominique had confessed to 23 killings, but prosecutors would not bring 23 separate murder convictions to completion. Instead, the investigation moved toward a plea agreement. That distinction is critical because public descriptions of serial murder cases often collapse three different concepts into one: confession, investigative attribution, and conviction. They are not identical. Dominique's confession became the basis for connecting him to 23 deaths. But the legal process ultimately resulted in 8 convictions. The decision to pursue a plea agreement was shaped by practical considerations. Prosecutors had to consider the enormous scope of the investigation, the evidence available in individual cases, the time required for multiple trials, and the impact on victims' families. A series of trials could have forced families to return to court repeatedly, listen to evidence about their loved ones, and endure years of additional proceedings. A plea agreement could establish permanent imprisonment while avoiding the uncertainty and duration of numerous separate trials. For Dominique, the benefit was equally clear. He avoided the possibility of the death penalty. For the state, the agreement secured multiple first-degree murder convictions and ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. But before that agreement was reached, the investigators had to confront the scale of what Dominique had told them. 23 murders meant nearly 10 years of possible criminal activity. It meant revisiting cases that had already been investigated and, in some instances, reconsidering deaths that had not initially been classified as homicides. It meant asking families to absorb information about circumstances that had remained unknown for years. It also meant accepting that some questions might never receive complete answers. Why did Dominique appear to stop for long periods? Why did the pattern accelerate in 2004 and 2005? Did every victim experience the same circumstances? Were there other victims who were never identified? The available information does not provide definitive answers to these questions. What investigators could establish was narrower and more concrete. Dominique had been arrested. Forensic evidence connected him to individual cases. A surviving witness provided information about his approach to potential victims. And Dominique himself had confessed to 23 killings. His statements were detailed enough to warrant extensive investigation. And investigators believed that many of the details corresponded with facts already known or subsequently verified. The confession, therefore, became a bridge between the individual cases and the larger suspected series. But it also created a difficult moral and legal reality. 23 families could receive information, yet not every case would result in a separate conviction. 23 names could appear in investigative summaries, yet only 8 would become the subjects of the first-degree murder charges to which Dominique ultimately pleaded guilty. That difference would become central when the case reached its final legal stage. On September 23, 2008, nearly 2 years after Dominique's arrest, he entered guilty pleas to 8 counts of first-degree murder. The agreement brought the courtroom process to a conclusion without a prolonged series of trials. Dominique received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. It was a severe sentence, but it was not the death penalty. And that outcome meant that the public record would forever contain 2 numbers, 23, representing the killings Dominique confessed to, and 8, representing the first-degree murder convictions secured through the plea agreement. For the families, neither number could restore what had been lost. A confession could explain where a loved one had gone. A conviction could establish legal responsibility. A life sentence could ensure the offender would never return to society. But none of those outcomes could return the years that had been taken from the victims. The confession answered some questions, but it also revealed how many questions had remained unanswered for so long. The next stage of the story would therefore move away from the interrogation room and into the courtroom, where the difference between what Dominique admitted, what investigators believed, and what prosecutors could prove would determine the final legal record of the Bayou Strangler case. The arrest and confession of Ronald Dominique did not automatically bring the legal process to an end. Investigators had spent years trying to understand a series of deaths spread across southern Louisiana, and Dominique had eventually confessed to 23 murders. But the courtroom required something more precise than a confession covering an entire decade. Prosecutors had to determine which cases could be pursued as first-degree murder charges and how the enormous scope of the investigation could be brought to a legal conclusion. This created one of the most important distinctions in the entire case. Ronald Dominique confessed to 23 killings, but he was ultimately convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder. Those numbers are connected, but they are not interchangeable. On September 23, 2008, Dominique entered guilty pleas to 8 counts of first-degree murder. The plea agreement resulted in 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The agreement represented the final legal resolution of the cases selected for prosecution. It did not mean that the other 15 deaths simply disappeared from the investigative record. Dominique's confession remained the basis for linking him to 23 victims. But the criminal convictions were limited to the 8 charges covered by the plea. Understanding that distinction is essential because the language surrounding serial murder cases can easily become imprecise. A person can confess to crimes that investigators believe are connected to him without being separately tried and convicted for every one of them. In Dominique's case, the legal record was narrower than the investigative picture. The decision to resolve the case through a plea agreement also avoided what could have been a prolonged series of trials. A prosecution involving multiple murder cases would have required prosecutors to present evidence repeatedly, potentially forcing families to return to court over and over. Each trial could require forensic testimony, witness testimony, photographs, and descriptions of the circumstances surrounding the deaths. For families who had already spent years without answers, the legal process could have become another prolonged period of uncertainty. A plea agreement offered a different path. It allowed the state to secure convictions for 8 first-degree murders and guaranteed that Dominique would remain in prison for the rest of his life, without the possibility of parole. At the same time, Dominique avoided the death penalty. Prosecutors had considered capital punishment, but the plea agreement provided an alternative that ensured permanent incarceration. In practical terms, the agreement gave the state certainty. Dominique would not return to society. The families would not have to endure multiple full trials, and the legal process could reach a final conclusion. Yet the courtroom resolution did not erase the investigative questions surrounding the other deaths. Dominique had confessed to 23 murders, and investigators had examined those statements against evidence from individual cases. His statements included information about victims, locations, methods, and places where bodies had been abandoned. Some details corresponded with information that investigators already possessed, including information that had not been widely released. That corroboration gave the confession significance beyond a simple claim of responsibility. Forensic evidence also played an important role. DNA associated with the Manuel Reed investigation was connected to Dominique, while hair evidence associated with Oliver Lubanks was reported as consistent with him. These forms of evidence were important because they provided independent connections between Dominique and individual victims. The investigation, therefore, did not rest entirely on his word. The legal resolution, however, still required prosecutors to choose which cases could be presented and resolved through the plea. The 8 murders covered by the guilty pleas included Michael Barnett, Leon Lirette, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Chris DeVille, Wayne Smith, and Nicholas Pellegrin. Their names represented a concentrated period in the later stages of the alleged killing series, particularly in 2004 and 2005. The deaths of these men had occurred at a time when the pattern appeared to be accelerating. By pleading guilty to their murders, Dominique accepted criminal responsibility for 8 specific first-degree murder charges. The consecutive life sentences meant that the sentences were stacked rather than served simultaneously. The result was 8 life terms without the possibility of parole. In practical terms, 1 life sentence alone would have ensured permanent imprisonment under the terms of the sentence, but the consecutive structure communicated the seriousness with which each individual conviction was treated. Each count represented a separate victim. Each conviction preserved a separate legal identity for the person whose life had been taken. This matters in a case where a list of victims can otherwise become reduced to statistics. The court did not simply sentence Dominique for the series. It convicted him of individual murders. Michael Barnett remained Michael Barnett. Leon Lirette remained Leon Lirette. August Watkins remained August Watkins. Kurt Cunningham remained Kurt Cunningham. Alonzo Hogan remained Alonzo Hogan. Chris DeVille remained Chris DeVille. Wayne Smith remained Wayne Smith. Nicholas Pellegrin remained Nicholas Pellegrin. The legal process could not restore their lives, but it could formally recognize the crimes against them. The prosecution also had to contend with the broader issue of Dominique's motive and explanations. Dominique had said that he feared returning to prison and that he killed victims after sexual assaults to eliminate witnesses. He also suggested that some victims had agreed to bondage or sexual activity. Those statements formed part of the investigative narrative. But the plea agreement meant that the court did not need to conduct a separate full trial for every case in order to reach a verdict. Dominique's guilty pleas were admissions of criminal responsibility for the 8 charged murders. The broader explanations he had offered did not erase that responsibility. They were part of his account, but the legal outcome was based on the charges to which he pleaded guilty. This distinction is especially important in understanding the role of motive in criminal cases. A prosecutor does not need to accept a defendant's explanation of why he committed a crime simply because the defendant admits that he committed it. The facts of the offense and the defendant's personal explanation are separate questions. In Dominique's case, the available information does not establish a complete psychological explanation for his actions. It only establishes what he said about his fear of prison and his alleged desire to eliminate witnesses. After the guilty pleas, the investigation did not suddenly become a simple story with every question answered. 23 murders had been confessed. 8 had resulted in convictions. The remaining cases occupied a more complicated space between investigative attribution and formal adjudication. Some were supported by forensic evidence. Some were connected through Dominique's statements. Some contained circumstances that investigators believed fit the broader pattern. But the legal system had reached its final judgment through 8 specific convictions. That is why the phrase 23 victims must be used carefully. It describes the number Dominique confessed to killing and the number investigators associated with his confession. It does not mean that 23 separate murder trials produced 23 convictions. The difference is not a technical footnote. It is the boundary between what investigators believed they had reconstructed and what the court formally established through guilty pleas. The outcome also raised a difficult question about justice. Was 8 life sentences enough when a man had confessed to 23 killings? There is no simple answer. For prosecutors, the agreement secured permanent imprisonment and avoided the uncertainty of multiple trials. For Dominique, it avoided the death penalty. For families, it offered finality without requiring years of additional courtroom proceedings. But finality and completeness are not the same thing. A case can be legally resolved while still containing unanswered questions. Families can know who was responsible and still wonder about the final moments of a loved one's life. Investigators can know that a suspect confessed and still recognize that not every detail can be independently established. A courtroom can close a case while the human consequences continue indefinitely. The legal resolution of the Dominique case, therefore, should not be measured only by the sentence. The sentence was 8 consecutive life terms without parole. That is the formal result. The broader result was that a man linked through confession and evidence to a decade-long series of deaths would never return to the communities where those victims had lived. But the story of the Bayou Strangler was never really about the sentence alone. It was about how long the deaths had remained disconnected, how many victims had become part of a pattern before the pattern was recognized, and how the legal system attempted to bring that history into a form that could be judged. The 8 guilty pleas created a clear legal endpoint. The 23 confessions left a much larger investigative legacy. And behind both numbers were the same people whose names had appeared in the files long before the public understood that they belonged to one story. For the families, the conclusion of the courtroom proceedings could not be the same thing as forgetting. A life sentence can imprison a perpetrator. It cannot reverse a death. A conviction can establish responsibility. It cannot restore a future. And a confession can answer some questions. It cannot return the years that were taken away. That is where the legal story of Ronald Dominique ends, with 8 convictions, 8 consecutive life sentences, and a permanent record of responsibility for those crimes. But for the broader investigation, the questions surrounding the other deaths, the circumstances that allowed the pattern to remain hidden, and the vulnerability of the victims would remain part of the story long after the courtroom doors closed. The legal resolution of the Ronald Dominique case came on September 23, 2008, when Dominique pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder and received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The courtroom had reached a definitive conclusion about those 8 murders. Dominique would remain in prison for the rest of his life. He would not return to the communities where the victims had lived, and he would not have the opportunity to repeat the violence that had defined the case. Yet a sentence, however severe, could never restore the lives that had been taken. That distinction is at the heart of what remained after the investigation ended. The name Bayou Strangler became widely associated with Dominique. But the case was never truly about a nickname. It was about 23 men and boys whose lives ended between 1997 and 2006 and whose deaths were eventually connected to one investigation. The chronology alone is difficult to absorb. David Mitchell was 19. Gary Pierre was 20. Larry Ranson was 38. Oliver LeBanks was 27. Joseph Brown was 16. Bruce Williams was 18. Manuel Reed was 21. Angel Mejia was 34. Mitchell Johnson was 34. Michael Vincent was 23. Then, after a period in which the known killings appeared to stop, Kenneth Randolph Jr. and Anoka Jones were killed in 2002. Datrell Woods followed in 2003. Larry Matthews and Michael Barnett died in 2004. The pace increased dramatically in 2005, with Leon Lirette, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Wayne Smith, Chris DeVille, and Nicholas Pellegrin. Christopher Sutterfield became the final name in the chronology provided in 2006. These names should not disappear behind the number 23. A serial murder investigation inevitably produces statistics, victim counts, dates, locations, years, convictions, and sentences. Statistics are useful for understanding scale, but they can also create distance. The victims were not numbers when they were alive, and they did not become numbers when they died. The available information does not provide enough personal detail to reconstruct each man's life. And inventing such details would be wrong. What can be stated with certainty is that every name represented a person with a life that existed before the investigation ever began. The case also exposed the consequences of social vulnerability. Several victims were described as living difficult or unstable lives, and some had problems involving drugs or previous criminal records. Those circumstances were sometimes part of the context surrounding their disappearances, but they should never be mistaken for explanations of why they deserved attention. A person's addiction, criminal history, poverty, or unstable circumstances does not reduce the value of his life. In a case like this, vulnerability can become dangerous in two ways. First, it can make a person easier for an offender to manipulate or approach. Second, it can make his disappearance less immediately visible. Dominique appears to have understood opportunity. The available information indicates that he could approach men through offers involving money, drugs, sex, or private meetings. That approach did not necessarily look like a violent crime at first. A meeting could appear voluntary. A private encounter could appear ordinary. The danger became apparent only after the victim was isolated. This is one reason Ricky Wallace's survival was so significant. Wallace's encounter with Dominique showed investigators what could happen before a murder occurred. Wallace had been invited to a trailer under circumstances involving drugs and sex. Dominique proposed tying him. Wallace refused and survived. His account provided a rare perspective that the dead could no longer provide. It showed that the alleged method could involve a progression from apparent agreement to coercive danger. His survival also reminds us that the investigation was not built entirely around the dead. Living witnesses mattered. Their experiences helped investigators reconstruct what might otherwise have remained invisible. The case also demonstrated the importance of forensic evidence and the limitations of investigations conducted across time. DNA connected Dominique to the Manuel Reed case, while hair evidence associated with Oliver LeBanks was reported as consistent with him. Those connections became particularly important because they provided physical evidence independent of Dominique's own statements. His confession to 23 killings was significant, but investigators still had to test his words against evidence. That principle remains one of the most important lessons of the case. A confession is powerful, but it is not automatically a complete and objective record of what happened. Dominique provided explanations that could reduce his apparent responsibility, including claims that some victims had agreed to bondage or sexual activities. He also said that he feared returning to prison and killed victims after sexual assaults to eliminate witnesses. These statements tell us what Dominique said about himself. They do not provide a complete explanation of his psychology, nor should they be treated as proof that every victim experienced exactly the circumstances he described. His statements had to be compared with forensic evidence, witness accounts, and known facts. The investigation also demonstrated how geography and jurisdiction can complicate the recognition of serial crime. The deaths occurred across multiple parishes in southeastern Louisiana. When cases are separated by jurisdiction, they can remain isolated for much longer than they might if all evidence were controlled by one investigative agency. A detective can know everything in one file and still not know what is sitting in another parish's file. The victim's circumstances could make the separation even greater. A disappearance involving a person with an unstable life might not immediately resemble the disappearance of someone from a more visible social environment. None of this means that investigators did not care. It means that serial murder often hides inside ordinary investigative boundaries. The pattern exists across cases, while the investigation may be organized case by case. Hurricane Katrina added another layer of difficulty. The 2005 storm affected the region and also affected forensic investigation and evidence processing. The case therefore demonstrates how even strong evidence can become complicated by time, geography, disasters, and the condition of investigative records. Yet despite those obstacles, investigators eventually assembled enough information to identify Dominique, arrest him, and compare his confession against the evidence. There is another important lesson in the difference between the 23 killings Dominique confessed to and the 8 murders for which he was convicted. The distinction reminds us that investigative truth and legal proof are not always identical. Categories. Investigators may believe that a person is responsible for a larger series based on a confession and corroborating evidence. Prosecutors, however, must decide which charges can be successfully pursued. Courts ultimately record convictions based on specific legal proceedings. In Dominique's case, 8 first-degree murder convictions resulted from the plea agreement. The other 15 deaths remain part of the investigative history associated with his confession, but they did not result in 15 additional murder convictions. This is not a contradiction. It is the difference between a confession covering a broad series and a legal judgment covering specific charges. The case also leaves unanswered questions. Did Dominique truly commit all 23 murders he confessed to? The information provided supports treating 23 as the number he confessed to and the number investigators associated with him, but it does not justify claiming that every one of those deaths was proven in court through an individual trial. Could there have been additional victims? That cannot be established from the available information. Why did the known pattern contain long periods of apparent inactivity? There is no definitive answer. Did every victim encounter Dominique under exactly the same circumstances? Again, the evidence provided does not establish that. What can be said is that investigators found a recurring pattern and that Dominique's statements corresponded with multiple known details. The unresolved questions do not diminish the significance of what was established. They simply mark the boundary between fact and speculation. That boundary matters in true crime storytelling. It is tempting to fill gaps with psychological theories or imagined conversations, especially in a case involving a serial offender. But the more disturbing truth does not require invention. The documented facts are already devastating. 23 men and boys died over a period of almost 10 years. Their bodies were left in isolated locations. Investigators eventually identified connections among cases that had once appeared separate. DNA and other evidence helped link Dominique to individual victims. A survivor provided important information about his method of approach. Dominique confessed to 23 killings. He later pleaded guilty to 8 first-degree murder charges and received 8 consecutive life sentences without parole. Those facts are sufficient to understand the scale of the case. The final reflection is therefore not about Dominique's personality or about the mythology that can surround serial killers. It is about the victims and the systems that failed to recognize their shared danger quickly enough. A killer can remain hidden when each death is treated as an isolated event. A vulnerable victim can become easier to overlook when society assumes his life is unstable or Complicated. A body discovered in a remote place can be separated from the story of the person who disappeared. And a case spread across multiple jurisdictions can conceal a pattern that becomes obvious only after years of investigation. The most important legacy of the Bayou Strangler case is therefore not the nickname attached to the offender. It is the reminder that every missing person and every unexplained death belongs to someone. Behind every case file is a human being. Behind every unidentified pattern are families waiting for answers. And behind every number is a name. The legal system ultimately ensured that Ronald Dominique would spend the rest of his life in prison. But justice cannot undo death. It can only acknowledge responsibility and prevent further harm. The lives lost between 1997 and 2006 remain the central fact of this story. Their names are the part that should survive the nickname, the headlines, the statistics, and even the offender himself. The final lesson is simple but difficult. When a series of deaths is viewed one victim at a time, the pattern can remain hidden. When those victims are finally placed together, the story changes. Not because the victims become a statistic, but because their individual cases finally reveal that they were connected by something they could not have known while they were alive. That connection ultimately led investigators to Ronald Dominique, brought him before the courts, and ensured that he would never again walk free. But the true measure of the case is not how long the offender remains remembered. It is whether the victims remain remembered as people whose lives mattered long before their names appeared in a homicide investigation. The story of Ronald Dominique is often reduced to a number, 23. It is the number associated with the killings he confessed to, the number that transformed a collection of separate deaths into the outline of a serial murder investigation. But numbers can conceal as much as they reveal. 23 is easy to repeat. It is much harder to understand what that number represents. It represents 23 individual men and boys, ranging in age from 16 to 46, whose lives ended over a period of almost a decade. It represents families and friends who had to live with disappearances, uncertainty, and eventually the knowledge that their loved ones had been murdered. And it represents a series that was not recognized as a single story until years after its earliest. Victims had died. The chronology begins with David Mitchell, 19, in July 1997. 5 months later came Gary Pierre, 20. In July 1998, Larry Ranson, 38, was killed. That October, Oliver LeBanks, 27, and Joseph Brown, 16, became victims. Bruce Williams, 18, followed in November. Manuel Reed, 21, was killed in May 1999, followed by Angel Mejia, 34, in June, and Mitchell Johnson, 34, in August. Michael Vincent, 23, died in January 2000. Then came a gap in the known chronology. Kenneth Randolph Jr., 20, and Anoka Jones, 26, were killed in October 2002. Datrell Woods, 19, followed in May 2003. Larry Matthews, 46, and Michael Barnett, 21, were killed in October 2004. The sequence became more concentrated in 2005. Leon Lirette, 22, in February. August Watkins, 31, and Kurt Cunningham, 23, in April. Alonzo Hogan, 28. In July, Wayne Smith, 17, in August. Chris DeVille, 40, in September, and Nicholas Pellegrin, 21, in November. Christopher Sutterfield, 27, became the final victim in the chronology provided. In October 2006, the ages alone show that this was not a series limited to one generation. The victims included a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old, men in their 20s, men in their 30s, and men in their 40s. The common denominator was not age. It was vulnerability and opportunity, within a pattern investigators eventually associated with Dominique. Many of the victims were described as living difficult circumstances, and some had problems involving drugs or previous criminal records. Those facts may have influenced the circumstances surrounding their lives and disappearances, but they should never be interpreted as a reason for their deaths. A person's struggles do not make him less deserving of protection. In fact, the case demonstrates how vulnerability can become something an offender exploits. Dominique could allegedly approach men through offers of money, drugs, sex, or private encounters. The interaction could begin without obvious violence that made the danger difficult to see from the outside. A man could enter a situation voluntarily, believing that he understood what he had agreed to, only to discover that the person accompanying him had very different intentions. Ricky Wallace's survival provides the clearest example available in the supplied information. Wallace encountered Dominique and was invited to a trailer under circumstances involving drugs and sex. Dominique proposed tying him. Wallace refused and survived. His experience is important precisely because it did not end in death. He could describe the encounter himself. The dead could not. Wallace's account gave investigators a perspective on Dominique's approach that could be compared with other evidence. It also showed that not every encounter necessarily ended in murder. Dominique later claimed that some people who refused to participate in bondage-related activities could leave. That claim must be treated carefully because it came from Dominique himself. But Wallace's survival provides an independent example of a potential victim who escaped. The existence of a survivor also changes the way the series can be understood. It shows that the offender's behavior was not simply a sequence of unavoidable confrontations. There were moments in which victims could resist, refuse, or leave. For the victims who did not survive, however, the outcome was different. Their bodies were found in isolated environments, ditches, fields, sugarcane areas, rural roads, and other locations where a body could remain undiscovered. The geography of southern Louisiana therefore became part of the investigation. The same landscape that shaped everyday life also provided places where violence could remain hidden. Multiple parishes were involved, including Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, St. Charles, Iberville. An assumption that geographic spread made the pattern more difficult to recognize. Each local agency might possess only one portion of the larger picture. The case therefore raises an important investigative question. How does a serial pattern become visible when no single detective initially possesses the complete set of information? In Dominique's case, the answer came gradually. Similarities in victims and circumstances provided one layer. Forensic evidence provided another. The Manuel Reed case eventually produced DNA evidence associated with Dominique. Hair evidence in the Oliver LeBancs case was also reported as consistent with him. A survivor supplied information about his method of approach. Finally, Dominique himself provided information about numerous killings after his arrest. Each source strengthened the others. But even after the investigation identified Dominique, the case did not answer every question. One of the most obvious questions concerns the number 23. Dominique confessed to 23 murders. Investigators connected those confessions to 23 victims. But only 8 of those murders resulted in first-degree murder convictions through the plea agreement. That difference should remain explicit. It does not mean the other 15 deaths were unimportant or that investigators simply ignored them. It means that the legal record and the investigative record were not identical. The criminal justice system ultimately resolved 8 specific murder charges. The broader investigative history contained 23 killings that Dominique confessed to. This distinction also creates uncertainty about whether every detail of every confession can be independently established. The information provided does not justify claiming that all 23 cases were proven in court. In the same way, some had forensic evidence, some were connected through statements, some involved circumstances that fit the broader pattern, but the degree of proof varied. This is precisely why responsible true crime storytelling must resist the temptation to turn an investigative conclusion into a courtroom fact. There are also questions about whether Dominique had additional victims. The available information cannot establish that. It is possible to recognize the uncertainty without converting it into speculation. The same applies to the periods when the known killings appeared to stop. After Michael Vincent in January 2000, there was a gap before the known sequence resumed in 2002. The information does not explain why. A responsible account cannot invent an explanation simply because the gap feels significant. The same caution applies to Dominique's psychology. Many stories about serial offenders attempt to construct a simple narrative involving childhood, sexuality, illness, isolation, or personality. But the supplied information specifically warns against treating those factors as causes of the murders. Dominique's own explanation focused on his fear of returning to prison. He said that he killed victims after sexual assaults to eliminate witnesses. That is evidence about what he claimed his motive was, not a complete explanation of his inner life. The distinction matters because understanding a motive is not the same as excusing a crime. Even if Dominique's explanation were accepted exactly as he presented it, it would not reduce the responsibility for the deaths. The legal outcome reflected that responsibility. On September 23, 2008, Dominique pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder and received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The agreement avoided a series of potentially lengthy trials and also spared Dominique the possibility of the death penalty. For the state, it provided certainty. For families, it provided a final legal resolution without requiring them to endure multiple murder trials. Yet no legal resolution could answer every human question. Families can know who killed a loved one and still wonder what happened during the final hours. They can know where a body was found and still wonder whether something might have been done differently. They can hear a confession and still feel that the explanation is incomplete. The justice system can establish responsibility, but it cannot recreate a life. This is why the legacy of the case should not be centered on Dominique. The offender already occupied enough of the story while he was committing the crimes. The enduring focus should remain on the people whose names form the chronology: David Mitchell, Gary Pierre, Larry Ranson, Oliver LeBanks, Joseph Brown, Bruce Williams, Manuel Reed, Angel Mejia, Mitchell Johnson, Michael Vincent, Kenneth Randolph Jr., Anoka Jones, Datrell Woods, Larry Matthews, Michael Barnett, Leon Lirette, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Wayne Smith, Chris DeVille, Nicholas Pellegrin, Christopher Sutterfield. These names are more important than the nickname attached to their killer. The case is a reminder that victims should not become visible only after a serial offender is identified. Their lives had value before investigators recognized the pattern. Their deaths mattered before the cases were connected. And their families deserved answers regardless of their circumstances. Perhaps the most important lesson is therefore also the simplest. A person can become invisible in a system long before he becomes a victim in a crime. When a missing person is viewed only through his problems, when a death is viewed only through one isolated file, or when cases are separated by jurisdiction and geography, a pattern can remain hidden. The Dominique investigation eventually demonstrated the opposite possibility. When information is brought together, connections that once seemed invisible can become undeniable. The final legal record contains 8 convictions and 8 consecutive life sentences. The investigative record contains a confession to 23 murders. But the human record contains 23 names. That is the number that should remain at the center of the story. Not because it is the most shocking statistic, but because every number represents someone who was here, someone whose life existed before the investigation, and someone whose absence changed the lives of others forever. The story of Ronald Dominique does not end simply with an arrest, a confession, or a sentence. Those events provide the framework of the case, but they do not fully explain how a series of deaths could continue for years before investigators were able to identify the connection. Between 1997 and 2006, 23 men and boys were associated with the killings Dominique eventually confessed to. Their ages ranged from 16 to 46. Their circumstances differed, their lives unfolded in different places, and their deaths were investigated through separate files and jurisdictions. Only later did those individual cases begin to form a single picture. That transformation, from separate deaths into a recognized series, is perhaps the most important part of understanding the Bayou Strangler investigation. At the beginning of the chronology was David Mitchell, 19 years old, killed in July 1997. 5 months later, Gary Pierre, 20, was killed. In 1998 came Larry Ranson, Oliver Lubanks, Joseph Brown, and Bruce Williams. Manuel Reed, Angel Mejia, Mitchell Johnson, and Michael Vincent followed through 1999 and early 2000. At that stage, there was no public understanding of a single offender responsible for all of them. The cases existed as individual tragedies. Some of the victims were men living under difficult circumstances. Some had problems involving drugs or previous criminal records. These details became part of their investigative backgrounds, but they should never be allowed to overshadow the central fact that they were victims of homicide. Their circumstances may have affected how visible their disappearances were, but they did not make their lives less valuable. This is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the case. A serial offender does not necessarily need to defeat an entire law enforcement system. Sometimes he only needs to operate in the spaces where separate cases are difficult to connect. Southern Louisiana provided a landscape in which that was possible. The killings were associated with several parishes, including Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, St. Charles, Iberville, and Assumption. The region contained rural roads, fields, drainage areas, sugarcane areas, and other isolated places where bodies could be left. A death occurring in one parish did not automatically become part of an investigation somewhere else. The geography itself could separate information. The circumstances surrounding the victims could create another barrier. When people live unstable lives, disappearances may not immediately produce the same level of attention as the disappearance of someone whose absence is immediately recognized by a large family or social network. That does not mean that investigators deliberately ignored the victims. It means that the conditions surrounding the cases could make the larger pattern harder to see. The case also illustrates how an offender can use ordinary human expectations as part of an approach. Dominique did not necessarily need to begin an encounter with obvious violence. According to the supplied information, he could use offers involving money, drugs, sex, or private meetings. A victim could agree to meet him without understanding the danger. Once the encounter became private, the situation could change. Ricky Wallace's survival demonstrated this possibility. Wallace was invited to a trailer in circumstances involving drugs and sex. Dominique proposed tying him. Wallace refused and left alive. His account became an important piece of the investigation because he could describe an interaction with Dominique that did not end in murder. His experience provided investigators with information that could be compared with the circumstances surrounding the dead victims. It also demonstrated that the alleged method involved more than a single moment of violence. There could be a process, contact, invitation, isolation, restraint, and then, in the cases that ended in death, lethal violence. But the exact circumstances of every victim cannot be reconstructed from Wallace's experience alone. That boundary must remain clear. The investigation ultimately depended on multiple forms of evidence. The Manuel Reed case produced DNA evidence associated with Dominique. Reed, 21, had been killed in 1999, and his death involved strangulation and evidence of sexual assault. The forensic connection gave investigators something independent of speculation. Hair evidence connected with the Oliver Lubanks case was also reported as consistent with Dominique. These pieces of evidence were particularly important because the investigation covered years. Memory fades, circumstances change, records may become difficult to locate or process. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 affected the region and also affected forensic investigation and evidence processing. The longer a case remains unresolved, the more difficult it can become to preserve every detail. Yet forensic evidence can remain capable of establishing connections even when the surrounding circumstances have become complicated. Dominique's arrest on December 1, 2006, represented the point at which these investigative threads finally converged. By then, investigators had forensic evidence connecting him to individual cases, information from a surviving witness, and a growing understanding of the similarities among the victims and circumstances. Then Dominique began to talk. His confession to 23 murders was extraordinary in scale. But the most important aspect of the confession was not simply the number. Investigators could compare his statements against information already known. According to the supplied material, he provided details about victims, locations, methods, and places where bodies had been abandoned, including information that had not been publicly released. This gave investigators a basis for testing his claims. The confession became another investigative tool, rather than the sole foundation of the case. Yet Dominique's statements also demonstrate why confessions must be treated carefully. He did not present himself in a way that accepted every aspect of responsibility without qualification. He described circumstances in which victims allegedly agreed to bondage or sexual activity. He suggested that some people who refused could leave. He also said that he feared returning to prison and killed victims after sexual assaults to eliminate witnesses. These statements may provide insight into how Dominique attempted to explain his actions, but they do not constitute an objective account of every crime. The victims could not provide their own version. That is why corroboration remained essential. The same caution applies to the question of motive. It would be tempting to search for one explanation that could make the entire series understandable. But the available information does not establish that childhood experiences, sexuality, illness, isolation, or any other personal factor caused the killings. Those subjects may appear in accounts of Dominique, but there is no basis here for turning them into a simple causal explanation. His own explanation, that he feared returning to prison and wanted to eliminate witnesses, should be identified as a statement, not treated as a complete psychological diagnosis. The legal process ultimately established a narrower and more certain record. On September 23, 2008, Dominique pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. The 8 victims were Michael Barnett, Leon Lirette, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Wayne Smith, Chris DeVille, and Nicholas Pellegrin. He received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. That outcome is the formal endpoint of the criminal case. It is also where an important distinction must be made. Dominique confessed to 23 killings, but he was not convicted of 23 separate murders. The 8 convictions resulted from the plea agreement. The other 15 killings remained part of the investigative history associated with his confession, but they were not separately resolved through 15 additional murder convictions. This distinction does not diminish the lives of those victims. It simply reflects the difference between an investigative conclusion and the final legal record. The plea agreement also avoided the possibility of a prolonged series of trials. Prosecutors had considered the death penalty, but the agreement secured permanent imprisonment. For Dominique, it meant avoiding capital punishment. For the state, it meant 8 convictions and certainty that he would never be released. For families, it meant avoiding the repeated burden of full trials. But no agreement could make the loss disappear. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to treat the sentencing date as the moment when everything becomes resolved. In reality, a legal conclusion and a human conclusion are very different things. A court can determine guilt. It cannot restore a son, brother, friend, or family member. A sentence can prevent an offender from harming others. It cannot return the future that was taken from a victim. And a confession can provide answers while still leaving families with questions that may never be answered. The Dominique case also leaves uncertainty about whether the 23 killings represent the complete extent of his crimes. The supplied information does not establish additional victims, and it would be irresponsible to claim that there were. The same principle applies to the unexplained gaps in the chronology. After Michael Vincent's death in January 2000, the known sequence pauses before the killings associated with Kenneth Randolph Jr. and Anoka Jones in October 2002. There is no definitive explanation in the provided material for that gap. It is possible to identify the absence without inventing a reason for it. That is the discipline required when reconstructing a case from historical records. The final picture is therefore both clearer and more incomplete than it first appears. Investigators identified Ronald Dominique. Evidence connected him to individual victims. A survivor helped illuminate his method of approach. Dominique confessed to 23 killings. He provided information that investigators could compare with existing evidence. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 8 first-degree murders and received 8 consecutive life sentences without parole. Those facts are established within the supplied record. Beyond them lie questions that should remain questions. What happened in every individual encounter? Were all 23 deaths independently provable to the same standard? Were there other victims? Why did the killings appear to pause for periods of time? The available information cannot answer those questions with certainty. And perhaps that is one of the most important lessons of the case. A responsible account does not need to fill every silence. Sometimes the most honest conclusion is to acknowledge what is known and stop where the evidence stops. Ronald Dominique spent years moving through a landscape where individual cases could remain separated from one another. Eventually, investigators connected those cases and placed his name at the center of the pattern. The law then ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. But the lasting significance of the case is not the notoriety of the offender. It is the recognition of the people whose deaths formed the investigation. 23 names should never become merely a statistic. David Mitchell, Gary Pierre, Larry Ranson, Oliver LeBancs, Joseph Brown, Bruce Williams, Manuel Reed, Angel Mejia, Mitchell Johnson, Michael Vincent, Kenneth Randolph Jr., Anoka Jones, Datrell Woods, Larry Matthews, Michael Barnett, Leon Lirette, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Wayne Smith, Chris DeVille, Nicholas Pellegrin, Christopher Sutterfield. Each was a person before becoming a name in a homicide file. The most meaningful ending to the story is therefore not the nickname Bayou Strangler, and not even the number of life sentences imposed on Ronald Dominique. It is the reminder that victims remain people after the investigation ends. Their lives existed before their deaths, and their absence continued to affect others long after the courtroom proceedings were finished. The case demonstrates how easily individual tragedies can remain disconnected until investigators are able to see the larger pattern. It also demonstrates why evidence must be tested, confessions must be corroborated, and uncertainty must be acknowledged. In the end, justice established responsibility for 8 murders and permanent imprisonment for their perpetrator. The broader investigation preserved the connection to 23 victims. And beyond those legal and investigative numbers lies the only perspective that should ultimately matter most. Every one of those lives mattered, whether or not the world recognized their connection while they were still alive.